I wish I had more copies of this to pass around. It's a free newsletter that comes out from the Dana Foundation once a month. And it's a very good way to keep up on stuff going on studies of the human brain. And it's written for people who don't have a strong neurological background, so it's very understandable. I'll pass this around, so you just take a look at it, and you can contact them. It's free. I suppose there's an online version, but I haven't run across that. It's a very handy book. For example, one of the articles there points out that the brain is now approximately 100 times more powerful than we thought it was about a couple months ago, because it turns out dendrites aren't just sort of wires that connect things, but actually do a lot themselves. So all kinds of interesting stuff. So get hold of the Dana Foundation. They're very nice, very helpful people. Is Jim here? Oh, is this our question period? I guess, is it? I don't have the schedule. Well, any questions, comments? Oh, let me say, one thing that Jim always says is that a question is a relatively short statement that ends with a question mark, and it is not a long paragraph that ends, don't you think so too? Okay, I think it's, but Jim always says this better. He always says everything better. Oh, okay, yes.
Yes, so when we all walked in here, there was a slide up that showed a brain and a
Yes.
neural map in a default state,
Yes.
and on psilocybin state, which had many more connections. And I wonder, I assume this was an adult type individual. I just wonder how this compares to the state of an infant's brain, especially in regard to the ability of, like infants, small children, to just consume and make connections and learn things at a highly accelerated rate, even though they don't have the cognitive ability, say, of an adult, and how that applies to, like, learning and doing new things as an adult later in life.
I have no idea, but boy, that would be fascinating to know. Yeah, that diagram just produces all these wonderful thoughts. I mean, is that on his question, or is that separate?
It's related. In regards to those photos, are there folks who are studying the default brain of the individual who is being exposed to psilocybin on a progressive level to see if the default brain is showing any greater neuroplasticity, greater connections, so on and so forth?
Well, did you want to ask a question about it?
Well, the question is, are we seeing any changes in the default images of the brains that are exposed to psychedelics and psychotropics? Is someone doing that, looking at the progressive after exposures to, I don't know, if it's only yoga or mindfulness or meditation or psychedelics, are we seeing greater and greater and greater connectivity?
I sure hope so, but I don't know anybody who's looked at it yet. I don't know the research on meditation and yoga, so I assume that's out there somewhere. But whether I would be shown this way, the usual way is to show like a picture of the brain, and you see parts that are hot and parts that are cold, and they're done at different levels. And this is derived from those pictures. So when that research has been done elsewhere, then that would be, you could make that kind of picture from that data, I assume. I don't know the details of how those diagrams were constructed, but it's basically the same information that you get on these cross sections and hot and cold in the brain.
My name is Brandon Denhode, and one thing, you did say questions and comments, it's more of a comment. I really appreciate the fact that you're creating new vocabulary for something like this, like when you say the term ideogen. I think more and more proper verbiage doesn't exist because we're still creating it, so thank you for, kind of taking a couple steps forward. And
Thank you. New fields do that, right? You have to settle down on your vocabulary, yeah. Look, I prefer, in my own work, to reserve the word entheogen for spiritual and religious use and talk about the entheogenic use of psychedelics. Now, some people use them as synonyms, and originally that was proposed as a synonym. To overstate it, I see it as kind of a sleazy public relations move. Now, and then it might have been necessary when it was proposed. Okay, but now the word psychedelic, I think, is... Now, Bob Jesse takes just the opposite position on that. At least he used to. I think he still does. And in that book that I showed with a little hand, the subtitle is Entheogen is in there. And the reason it's in there is the publisher wanted it in there. You know, publishers have the last word because they print it. So I'll go along with it. And there are some very good organizations that have the word entheogen in the title. So, you know, I mean, you know, so they're using that synonym idea.
On the reference of neuroprotectiveness for entheogens, ironically, it goes way back to the Nixon administration. Nixon was very concerned about the upsurge in cannabis use, and he went to Jamaica with some researchers, hopefully to find out that chronic use caused brain damage. However, when he came back and found that after cognitive assessment that these people did better than the average standard, you know, individual the same age group, and the recommendation was to make, at that point during Nixon's time, cannabis legal, but of course it was squashed. And then later on, when ecstasy, same thing, that there were certain things coming out with the use of ecstasy in psychotherapy, that it was also neuroprotective, and that was squashed. And then probably around 10 years ago, UCLA people went down to Brazil and did an assessment on ayahuasca use in UDV, and the same thing happened, that when you gave them a standard neurocognitive assessment, that they did better than the average person.
I think the fact that so much of culture has changed since the situation you're describing is a sample of the progress that's being made. You know, I mean, for instance, the New York Times having a couple of white front-page articles on MDMA, and then Science Magazine and American Scientists and all this sort of general science, BBC and NPR having shows. So this stuff is catching on. And of course, Ayat Waldman's book on microdosing was reviewed, and it was reviewed in the New York Times, and more importantly, it was not reviewed in the book review section, it was reviewed in the front page of the styles section. So she reached a readership, people who would read the style sections of the New York Times, who normally would not run across this information at all. So my concern is that some people who should not be using either microdosing or more doses will get into trouble and sort of give a bad name to the whole field. And that's a real problem. Is there another?
Hi. You mentioned experimental philosophy as something that you thought was waiting to be developed. And I'm just wondering if you know of any academic environments where that's being considered, or any books that are talking about that, or anybody who's sort of spearheading that or interested in that experimental.
One of the speakers here, his name is Peter, I think it's Sjostad, hyphen with an H, I forgot. It's a Scandinavian name and an English name, has worked in this field. His approach is generally looking at how recognized philosophers like Nietzsche have used various mind-altering substances. So that's going in that direction, but it isn't quite there yet. And I would really like, there are enormous policy issues. Suppose a professor or professors in a philosophy department at a university want to start a laboratory course for their graduate students. Okay? Now, who can give permission for that? Is that a Food and Drug Administration? Well, it's not really a medical use. And the same thing sort of applies in religion. There are all these incredible policy issues that come up when you talk about psychedelics used in a non-medical psychotherapeutic session. There are enough just in medical psychotherapeutic problems. When you go into these other fields, for example, suppose a rather standard church decides to have a summer, let's say, recess for people who want to try psychedelics as a spiritual aid. Is this a freedom of religion issue? Is it a medical issue? Is it a legal issue? And what kind of issue is it? And the problem is all of the above. these are really messy, complex issues. Well, we'll work them through, but we have to start thinking about working them through. I'm particularly interested in the scholarly academic stuff, you know. Neshe isn't here, is she? Neshe Deveneaux? Okay, she's written a paper and on interpreting romantic writers as having experiences that were mystical experiences similar to psychedelic experiences. So suppose she wanted to teach a course for either graduates or undergraduates to make that point clear. And the best evidence, of course, is to have that experience. Okay, now, she's not going to be able to do this at a state university as it is now, but this is an intellectual freedom. I think academic, like American Association of University Professors and freedom of thought people ought to get in on this item. So one of the things I hope will happen is that these various groups will realize, oh, you know, I've got a oar in this too, and I should get interested in this.
Who did you say was doing that research, that wrote that paper? Can you give me her name?
Oh, the philosopher?
Yeah, on the romantic.
Oh, Nesce. It rhymes with Neshe. There's a, I don't know what this is. It's a Turkish name. There's something under the S. Deveneaux, Devenot. I'm pretty sure. Oh, she's doing a poster session here.
Okay.
She's probably here right now somewhere. Yeah, and she's the person to ask about that. She's very, very bright, alert person. She was a undergraduate at Penn about 3 years ago and organized a conference called Psychedemia. So she's the person to get in on that.
Have you seen any work done like on activating the pineal gland in particular as a way of communicate? Because a lot of like Dr. Joe Dispenza and some of the other people that do a lot of work with meditation and brain change, he focuses in on the pineal gland as the key to so much of our ability for telepathy as well as for reaching higher states of consciousness, that's where a lot of it's. Have you seen any research around that?
All I know is what I read in Rick Strassman's books on DMT and the pineal gland, which is not much. So.
Thank you.
Was there one back there somewhere?
I just kind of wanted to piggyback off what you just said, sir, as far as the pineal gland goes. Rick Strassman is actually doing work with Wim Hof. Is anyone familiar with Wim Hof and his methods? Doing his breathing technique, it feels like the onset of a DMT trip. And I just looked it up a couple weeks ago, and he's doing work with Rick Strassman and kind of figuring out how to access that more regularly. I just figured I'd add that.
Thank you so much for all your presentations. It's really wonderful to hear. I came in a little late, there's a little bit of a bottleneck at the door. You might have gone over this already. Since the title of this session is around innovation and creativity and the new psychedelic culture, I was just wanting to get your definitions and understanding of what creativity is, and if you can give me a definition of what innovation are, just so I can contextualize all this within that framework.
I can, but it's not very satisfying because creativity was the first issue I got interested in. When I was in 5th grade, I wanted to become an inventor. So I asked my mother, how do you become an inventor? Okay, that's the creativity issue for a 10-year-old. And I've read a lot on it. And I know the reason it's difficult is that there are so many different approaches to what creativity is. So I wouldn't say anything that just isn't sort of, well, thinking up new ways of doing things or putting things together in new situations. And the problem is the distinction between doing something new and doing something new that's useful or helpful or so forth. I have lunch with some retired professors, and one is a art history person. We get into the question of when is an artist creative and when is an artist just doing something new? You know, and this is one of the unsolvable things. I wish I could give you a better. Well, I showed a book right near the beginning by Robert Sternberg, who has written probably one of the best books on creativity, although it's probably now 20 years old, but he sort of summarized a lot of the work. And in this book I showed, it was a different book that had to do with intelligence, but I've lost track of the field, but Sternberg would be a way to get into it. And he talks about a lot of the different uses for it. But what comes out of this is that as people are in different mind-body states, they do perceive differently and think differently and produce things differently. So there's clearly a shift or a help in getting in different mind-body states. For example, you mentioned vocabulary. My best thinking is when I wake up about between 3 and 4 in the morning and can't get back to sleep. And I will have, like, I think a pretty good idea, the idea of mind-body state, okay, came out of that one. And I've too often thought, this is a really good idea, because I'm not very critical at that point. This is a really good idea. I got to remember when I get up in the morning, and you know just what happens. So I've got to get up and write it down, okay? Otherwise, I'll get up in the morning and think, oh, I had a good idea. What was that? Well, it's an interesting thing. I mean, we've got a shift in a mind-body state doing here. Fortunately, my I have an office right next to my bedroom. So I just go in and jot it down and then go back to bed. But it's often when I'll be awake like an hour and a half, 2 hours, and my mind just sort of, I let it go, but it's on work somehow, and an idea will just pop up. And it pops up, and the way I experience it is, this is the word I want to use. It's a very word-oriented thing, like ideogen, okay, and multistate theory. I mean, those come out of that almost asleep kind of thing. And of course, it helps if I'm working on something before I go to bed. Like I work on the computer and then, go to bed, and my mind is sort of going around. Yeah, it helps keep a notepad by your bed. Yes, it sure does. I wonder where Jim is. Is Jim in here? Huh.
Just to follow up, I just wanted to also, again, if you could give your interpretation just on the difference between creativity and innovation specifically, like how you see those words being the same or different. No opinion on that.
In common usage, innovation really implies something useful. That's all. So, but that's just a common language comment. So.
Yeah, I have a question, particularly related to psychedelic use. Have you found a way to, if there is a mind state you want to reach, like being more creative or being more artistic, is there a way to kind of harness it when you want to use it? Because my experience has been, particularly with psychedelics, sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. You don't have a lot of control over which mind state you end up in.
I haven't with psychedelics. And in psychotherapy, it's a good idea to take psychedelics and psychotherapy with an intention and to state or know your intention. When I take psychedelics, I prefer to say, let's see what will happen, and be unintentional about it. That works best for me. But I'm not particularly trying to solve a problem. We've probably always had the experience of getting ready to do a trip. You get something pretty around, and I want to listen to this CD and this music, and then you end up spending an hour and a half looking at the back of your thumb. So I found preparation doesn't really work much, for me anyway. So I just sort of, let what happens happen, and just follow, just let it go. I wish I could come up with a good thing. Now probably. Well, Jim will talk about microdosing, and that probably is the best, one of the easiest creative ways. But it's because it's organized toward helping daily functioning. You know, and it's particularly not oriented toward big problem solving. This paper that he wrote that came out in 1966, Willis Harman was the main author, and Byron Stolaroff and a whole bunch of other people. It's really a fascinating study. If there's anything that really ought to be followed, it's this problem solving, using psychedelics as problem solving. What they did is they had professionals, mathematician, physicist, and some designer, architects, scholars, who had been working on a problem for a long time and been unsuccessful in solving it. So in other words, they'd done the preparation, they thought about it, they read about it, they tried working with the problem. It wasn't just sort of, go in there and let's see what ideas we get. And they had them in groups of 4. Jim should tell us. Oh, by the way, Jim's book, A Guide to Psychedelic Seekers, is that the right title? Something like that. There it is, yes. It's really fine on this, on creativity. Because Jim, everybody else reports on the results of this experiment, but Jim has transcripts of what some of the people said during the experience and describes it in great detail. It's really the book on psychedelics and creative problem solving. But what they did anyway is they had the people come into this place in Menlo Park. They would have a fairly strong dose of either LSD or mescaline. They would sit for a while and sort of think about the problem. No, they would get together and discuss it with the other 4 people. So this is my problem, it's what I'm working on. Then they would separate off and work on it for a while. And then sort of like after lunch or after a while, they come back and discuss it with the other group. And they got all kinds of very strange things that had to do with theoretical physics, and an architect who had a very odd shaped lot that they had to design for, a designer of chair. Oh, here comes the man right now. Okay, Jim, I'm telling you about your experiment with creative problem solving, so I think it's time for you to take over.
Once upon a time in a galaxy far away, when psychedelics were legal, and all the world felt that if you just could hold hands, that we would all have world peace. We were doing clinical work with LSD at a small group in Menlo Park with a license from the government. And one of us, Willis Harman, professor for electrical engineering at Stanford University, said, I bet that psychedelics could be used for hard science. And the evidence was totally the other direction. As many of you know, when you have a certain amount of psychedelic, your work life becomes trivial. A little higher, it's an illusion. A little higher, you have no idea what being a human being is. So the evidence was not in our direction, but Willis thought it might be a good idea. And so we did bootstrapping, which meant that 4 of us got together with a low dose of psychedelics and developed the protocol for the study of taking a low dose of psychedelics to solve a problem like designing a study. That is not in the publication. But what we then did was set up a situation where, in order to get in the study, you had to have struggled with a problem for which you were qualified by your own scientific background, but you'd struggled for several months and had failed. And the kind of senior scientists we got had a very low percentage of failures in their lives. These were very successful people. We wanted them to care about the problem a lot and care about themselves a lot, but only in relation to their problem. We gave them a prep the night before and said, this is going to be the most creative day of your life. We were not concerned with the placebo effect and all that nonsense, because we knew if you give people enough psychedelic, they know it's not a placebo. So in groups of 4, 100 micrograms of LSD or 200 milligrams of mescaline, depending on what we had on the shelf. Couple of hours of music and eye shades. A totally worthless interruption where we gave them some psychological tests of creativity. And they all did, of course, wildly better. And then they could work on their problems. 48 problems, 44 solutions. Breakthroughs in a number of fields, papers produced, patents, products. It's one of the real tests of creativity is, does it function in the world? Becoming a better artist is always hard to determine. Solving a scientific problem is very clean. That was the study, and as we were doing our 7th or 8th group, we got a letter from the federal government that said, as of the receipt of this letter, your research is terminated. We had 4 people lying in our treatment room, which was the prototypical living room, you know, lovely furniture, beautiful art, flowers. And I looked at the letter, I was the youngest member of our team, and I said, I think we got this letter tomorrow. So they finished, the research finished, and the government said, we don't want to know anything more. So it was very successful. It has, there are people who've asked to replicate it, and the critical element, this is a set and setting question, the critical element in a creativity study is you have to care a lot about the problem. And if you want to see the offshoots of that work, I recommend a very small private retreat called Burning Man. You'll see some art, and if you talk to the artists, you will find that the solutions to some of the just extraordinary and magnificent art at Burning Man was aided by psychedelics. So, thank you.
We're still in the, do you have the mic? We
Yeah.
have some more problems or questions.
Now, by the way, a question, since we have limited time, a question, this is kind of Fadiman's problem, which is a question is a single sentence and it ends with a little oh in speech. And it never starts with, I have to tell you about my trip.
See how much better Jim is at saying that than I am? See why I like to be with him?
Okay, question please.
So in your slide earlier where you had a list of mind apps or technologies for mind-body states, there was one that looked like an acronym, OPSIN or OPSINs. I was wondering what that is. Thank you.
Neuroscientists have been able to put little like attachments to neurons that will light up when they're active, or you can shine a light on them and make the neuron active. So this is an optical way of doing things in the brain. This is one of the really hot little fields coming along right now. And they've been able to go from just looking at one neuron to the whole series that are called connectome. How different parts of the brain are connected with each other is now becoming increasingly important, rather than just looking at what does this part do and what does this part do and what does that part do, because it's being recognized, this connection. So, and this little thing that I have, that I hope somebody passing it around, the newspaper from Dana Foundation, is a great way to find out about that stuff. Oh, also, there's something called, it's a news system called Science Daily, and you can, it has topics, and you can just put in your topic, and every day it'll just send you the news on that topic. And there is one for illegal drugs. Although I'm interested in the mind-brain one. And like this new stuff is coming along all the time. It's coming along so fast. Well, for example, I mentioned this thing about dendrites actually doing stuff. They're not just wires. And suddenly, I mean, suppose we could design a computer that absolutely perfectly mimics everything our brains do now and everything we know about the brain, right? And then tomorrow there'll be new stuff about the brain, and this old model will know, well, it won't be up to date. I think it's one of the real problems of artificial intelligence trying to model the human brain, is that we keep on finding more and more about the brain, and that the computers would have to be constantly updated, or the theory of a computer have to be constantly updated. So I think it's a extremely worthwhile thing to do, but I am very skeptical about when it'll get to the point that it'll really be a very close simulation to the human brain.
Yeah, question on the early presentation on multiple selves. A lot of that is very similar to what Gurdjieff had taught back about 100 years ago. And I guess the question is, in his model, there was methods of consolidating some of these multiple selves to basically take control, so to speak, and enhance one's state of being. Do you see any collaborations with those ideas and psychedelics to make it more easily accessible?
I didn't quite understand your question. What was the 100 years ago?
Gurdjieffian psychology.
Yeah.
In other words, a lot of that was emphasis on multiple selves. And
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, disassociation, and we'll perhaps talk a little bit about it. Disassociation was a term for mental distress, meaning imagine a little kind of cover with a bunch of telephone wires. If you disassociate those wires, at some point the system will begin to show stress. That was the model of mental health and mental illness. Charcot, Janet. A guy named Freud was a student of theirs and got it and proposed very seriously to be part of that growing world of using multiplicity as the defining characteristic of mental health and illness. Freud, as you know, had a change of heart. Mainly, he stopped saying that his patients had had sexual abuse from their parents, possibly because a lot of his clients were the children of his friends. But in any case, he came down hard against disassociation. There was, by the way, a fight with Charcot, which is Charcot sued him for stealing intellectual property and never giving Charcot credit, another problem. Freud basically suppressed the whole notion of multiplicity, which we are now reviving. So we're simply, again, science has this wonderful thing, is if you pile up enough data, the paradigm eventually flips to take in the new data. If you suppress data long enough, it creeps out at the edges, and that's why in the 60s we were the counterculture. Now the paradigm is shifting and we're becoming the culture.
Hi.
Remember, one sentence.
Yeah. So I have several part
No,
questions, all
one.
about the same thing, which is the microdosing study.
We're going to get to it after lunch.
Oh, okay. Okay. So
Way in the back. Way in the back to the left with a gray something and a hand.
Hi, Jim. I want to ask more about the study that you did with Willis Harman. So once they were on the LSD or the mescaline, did you just turn them loose to focus for the next 8 hours on the problem? Did they stop? Did they journey? You said
Sure.
eye folds.
How
did you direct
How,
that
how did we
process?
keep them from wandering off?
Yes.
Was that the question?
Yes.
One is, only I think 1 out of our 28 people had prior psychedelic experience, so we never mentioned that you could wander off. Two is the variables were set and setting, and the mental set was attention to the problem. So they had brought with them, kind of pads of paper or boards or something to write notes on. And we said, now you can work on your problems. And now remember, we had 4 people. So there was a certain amount of group energy problem focused. Now, we did have one person who had just a lovely afternoon and did nothing. He came back, and we gave him a half dose. And we served it in like little silver tumblers, a little tray, and a little bit of symbology. And as I walked in with the tray, I moved so he would take the one that he was supposed to, and he moved the tray, and I moved it back. And he developed something called the mouse and word processing. Not during our session, darn it. He'd already developed those. But basically we found that if you tell people, and we pushed set and setting as hard as we could to keep them focused, and we did, and then they only had about 3 or 4 hours working on their problem. Most of them went home and stayed up till 3 in the morning, continuing working on their problem, not tripping. And we asked them about their creativity in the ensuing months, and basically they said, I'm more creative, and kind of went back to baseline in a couple of months. So again, one of the reasons I like LSD is it has no agenda, which is it's much more malleable for specific uses. How many of you have had ayahuasca? Okay, it has an agenda, right? It's not a bunch of molecules. It's a plant spirit. And its agenda, fortunately, is that they would like us not to destroy all the plants and each other. I think ayahuasca actually didn't care as long as we were just killing each other. But when we start to take down the rainforest, so the creativity study, as I say, had this cleanliness to it. It had no agenda, and it had tight focus, and that's the answer to the question.
Jim, on the problem solving, I think I read that one of the architects in your study kind of went visually through the history of architecture.
Yeah.
I thought I read that. So my question is, was much of the problem solving done in the visual imagination? Could you comment on
Good.
that?
That's actually a very good question. The architect obviously thought visually. But people who were also doing matrix algebra ended up thinking visually. And what it looks like, there's a term called pattern recognition. Pattern recognition is you see more of the pattern. What happened with our creativity people is that was the fundamental shift, enhanced pattern recognition. More things fit more easily. They could run experiments. But it was almost all visual. And one of the most beautiful was someone who was doing circuit design. And he would create in his mind a circuit with capacitors and resistors. And then he would mentally run electricity through it and see where it failed. And then in his mind, he would rewire and redo things and run another experiment. So he was running experiments that he did not know the answer to because he was setting it up as a visual problem. So one of the things that happened with almost all of our creativity people is it was more visual. With the particular architect you're talking about, he was designing a little shopping center. And he said, I could walk into the shopping center, I could look up and look at the beams and see what size bolts were being used to hold beams together. I could count the parking places. And when he eventually turned out drawings, he didn't use any of the drawings he'd made during our session, but he later went back and looked at them. He said, because I knew the building. Okay?
So, I was listening to Donald Hoffman at SAND this year, and he's talking about how in our human culture, all we're really sorting for is breed and greed.
Is this going to be a question?
Yes. And survival and mating is the two dominant what humans are looking for.
Okay.
And you translate that to Wall Street of breed and
Wait,
greed.
wait.
Okay.
A sentence with a question mark.
Okay. So does that fit with what your work shows?
Are people basically rotten, you mean? No.
So what are pieces, are they not sorting for that, or is there something bigger than the mass hallucination we're
I
sorting?
recommend the MAPS conference, and I'm not kidding. The question of what are people really like, there are those of us who think that people are fundamentally divine beings encased in this thing, what Buddhists call the skin bag full of dirt. Or there's kind of lust and aggression, and that's what runs the thing. And the power and money is a form of, lust is a very general term. Lust for stuff, lust for experience, lust for sex, lust for power. And again, if you look at small children, they don't seem to show that behavior. The other thing is I have 2 dogs who are rescues, and you don't know about a rescue's background, but it was clear from some of their behaviors that some of their behaviors are trauma-based. And that my little 6-pound Cheepom, who is among the most loving beings on earth, also is furiously aggressive, which is suicide when you're 6 pounds, for large dogs. Okay? So I would not say my dog is inherently aggressive because it has selves. But my aggressive 6-pound dog is just a little danger, mainly to himself. So the question, I think, for each of us is how do you feel other human beings are? And usually you're guessing from who you believe you are. And I come from the hippy-dippy 60s where when you looked at someone and said, "You're God," and they said, "You're God," you then found that the discussion was kind of over. So maybe one more question and we'll...
I don't know where we are on the schedule.
Yeah.
Hi, I wasn't aware about your study with creativity, but from what I've heard from the discussion, it seems like it's individual problem solving.
Yeah.
Do you know of anyone, or have you tried, or whatever, of collective problem solving?
Yeah. Good question.
So like psychotons, and also not for solving, let's say, to solve, like, I'm thinking more about the complex problems of society we have today.
Sure.
So
Well, let's just take it at the question I can answer, which is, how about groups? Now, remember I said how we started with a group? What we found is that a group problem solving needed incredible desire to solve the problem from all members, and very often the weakest member would kind of destroy the unity of the group. So we found groups didn't work well because they weren't involved enough. Even when we were designing it, we had that problem. Because we also then did a problem-solving session, because this was mainly engineering types, and we were inventing things. We just thought, why don't we invent things? And so we came up with 2 inventions. One was that instead of using a needle on a record, you could use a beam of light. So we pre-invented the CD, basically, many, many years earlier, but we weren't interested. We also invented something to aid in the skill of urination. Many of you don't even know about that, but some of us find that aiming is an issue, especially if you're a small child. So we invented small paper toys that went in the toilet that you aimed at. Now, there has been later research of putting an artificial fly, fly, in men's urinals, and there's less spillage. And recently, the Japanese have reinvented our pee-pee toys, only with electric power. So that's a kind of fairly ridiculous answer to a very kind of serious question. And the answer in terms of solving society's major problems, probably you would need to break it down into component parts and have the kind of people who have this background and the intention to work on those problems. So maybe one more question.
Can I make a comment on the urinary question? Those of you who have small boys and want to teach them to pee in the pod, drop a Cheerio in there and tell them to try to sink it.
With regard to your psychedelics for creative problem-solving study, did you guys track the data between mescaline and LSD, and if there's a difference in how efficacious they were?
No.
No.
No, and I won't cover it in microdosing, but psychedelics, almost all psychedelics, I mean classical psychedelics, mescaline, peyote, LSD, psilocybin, all seem to have the same effect at the microdose level and have basically the same effect at the higher dose level. And as you do the research over the weekend, the psilocybin people, two reasons why people use psilocybin, which they may mention. One is it's not LSD, so you can get your grant easier. And two is it's shorter so the staff can go home. Other than that, no differences. When we get into some of the exotic stuff that some of you know about, I don't know about those. But I will say 1P LSD is available and legal in Canada. That's a hint.
James, very brief question for you. I had heard about a month ago that you were on the Today Show talking about microdosing.
Yeah.
I started looking for that online and couldn't find it. Do you know if it is available and easily accessible? And thank you for doing that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
If you're interested in obscure places that I've appeared talking about microdosing, go to jamesfadiman.com. My wonderful assistant stacks that stuff up. Yeah, the Today Show had Ayelet Waldman's book as its feature, and basically we said nice things about microdosing. The interesting part was they had a DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration official on. Nobody ever asks them about us. And what he said on camera was, don't take bad stuff that isn't what you ordered. He didn't say anything about the psychedelics were bad, but that the N-bomb and other terrible things you shouldn't take, which I thought was fantastic. Off camera, he said, we don't really care much about psychedelics. And we don't care anything about microdosing. And if you think about it, there's no money in it, and there's almost no crime. And there's nothing, you know, a cartel says, oh boy, I'm going to sell a tab, it's going to be $6, it's going to last a month. This is not a business opportunity for the Medellin cartel. So we're at the moment under the radar, and I urge you to keep it that way. So let's now stop the questions, and let me turn it over to Tom.
Could I have the maps people help me distribute something?
I'm going to use the stair.
Okay. Maps people? Oh, they're not here. Well, okay. Take one and pass it on. How do I get the next? Yeah, I need the next one. And put on 3, I think. Oh, yes, if you can speed, there's some, pass it around. Oh. Here it is. It'll have to do with religion. That's it, religion draft 2. This afternoon I'll want the Snow White one. Good. Good, thanks. This really catches the theme of what I want to talk about for the next few minutes. Solomon Schachter's daughter asked him this. This is appears in the book that I edited called Psychedelic Entheogen Development. No, that's not the right title. We'll get to it in a minute. Okay, so the question is, when we're awake, can we wake up even more? And this is what I want to look at, largely from a spiritual perspective. This earlier, I used this slide and pointed out that I wanted to talk about the entheogenic use of psychedelics, and this is the part that we're on now. And this is largely, I like to use entheogen and restrict it to religion and spiritual development. So let's take a look at what I call the Entheogen Reformation. There's an article called Entheogen Reformation. I'll pass this out too. It came out, I only have 1 or 2 copies, and I'll pass these along again just so you can take a look at where to find out some more. This is published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology last year. Okay, I don't have a whole pack of these to go. Just okay, and this is one on Bill Richards' book, Sacred Knowledge, which is the best book that I know of on the religious use of psychedelics. And finally, a special for Christians about frankincense being psychoactive. Well, no, these are just, I only have 1 each to pass around. Okay. So this next slide is one of the sort of heavier slides, and it really packs a lot of information together. The main point I want to make is that just as 500 years ago, Western culture went through what became the Reformation and the Protestant Reformation, that we're now going through a similar transition in what I looked at as the Entheogen Reformation. And this sort of follows point by point parallels between the two. The development of the printed word with Gutenberg, who actually invented the ability to make separate letters and put them together, which allowed him to do the printing press and started printing the word, democratized the printed word. I'm going to use this Amanita muscaria to talk about describing psychedelics as entheogens, but that'll just be the image. The route to knowledge 500 years ago changed from ritual, where basically for most Western Europe, being religious meant going to a church or a large cathedral on a Sunday and following holidays, church holidays. So basically it was the stuff you did or observed, and that's being substituted now with direct mystical experience. Spiritual knowledge used to be seen, and I'm going to say used to when I'm actually talking about the way things are now versus where they think they're moving. That knowledge has to do with doctrine, dogma, belief, ideology, words. In other words, if we ask somebody about their religion, we expect to hear that person tell us what the person believes or thinks, not the rituals they perform. Prior to the Gutenberg Reformation, the description would have been the rituals that they performed. So we moved from a period of ritual to a period of words. Now I think we're moving to a fourth period of unmediated direct perception of the spiritual. The main academic disciplines were, and now still are, predominantly theology and philosophy, whereas I think we have to start to include biology and psychology. And here we may get into experimental religion and experimental religious studies, just as we talked about experimental philosophy before. Ethical actions, basically the Decalogue, do this and don't do that, with a lot of other church things entered in, and now the sense of a moral sense can be directly perceived. I'll talk about a new path of moral development, or newly recognized path of moral development as we go on. And education in religion was reading and understanding texts, and now it's experiencing transcendence. The move from the ritual to the word-oriented period, which we're now in, is nicely caught by this book, and it's instead of trying to get beyond passage, Protestants would be encouraged to focus on the precise, original, and supposedly unchanging Word of God in print. And in terms of a flow pattern, this is what I see happening. 500 years ago, we had sacred rites, starting with the Gutenberg, sacred texts, and now sacred experiences. So entheogens now are becoming to religion what texts used to be and actually largely still are. Entheogen, I use the Oxford English Dictionary definition of it, as a psychedelic. They're intentionally used spiritually. So this is not the definition of entheogen as a synonym for psychedelic. So let's take a look at some of the places this appears. Entheogens do not include only psychedelics, but other ways of directly having an experience that we attribute to God or spiritually. I don't say that entheogen generates the experience of God. I think of it as generating an experience which is then interpreted or not interpreted theologically. So it's the experience that is primary, and the interpretation is separate from the experience itself. And there are a lot of other entheogens, just as there are psychedelic entheogens, and those are listed here. So what we're talking about now is democratizing entheogens. This is part of what's going on. It's happening in this conference to a lower amount, but still to some extent, because we're still largely on the medical psychedelic psychotherapy angle. This is said very nicely in a book called Psychedelic Drugs Reconsidered. If you can get hold of this, I recommend it, and especially the hardcover book. This was published in 1972, and up to that time, and now, unfortunately, it still is, the major summary of psychedelic research. The reason to get hold of the paperback edition is that it has a 40-page annotated bibliography, which is an absolutely stunning piece of bibliographic work. If some of you who've written, bibliographies or even abstracts knows what a job it can be to try to get a whole article or a book shrunk down into a paragraph or two. And this has happened with this book. It's an absolutely astounding book. There are several editions available, but all the paperback editions have the bibliography, the annotated bibliography. So what we're talking about here is the ability of entheogens to cause or occasion a mystical experience. The word mystical has very different meanings in the philosophy of religion than it does in common ordinary speech. In common ordinary speech, it means sort of vague, a little scary. Maybe if there were a movie called zombies from outer space invade Area 51 that might be described as a mystical movie. In religion, mysticism has a very specific or cluster of very similar meanings. Most of them are more or less the same. So we'll take a look at those in just a minute. We want to talk about the importance of mysticism in religions. This, I think, says it quite well. Isn't religion, above all, before it is doctrine and morality, rights, and institutions, religious experience? So what we're having is the possibility of developing the experience, which is the root of religions, but is often neglected. What is a mystical experience? I challenged my undergraduate class to come up with a mnemonic device for remembering the aspects of a mystical experience. So they divided it into little groups and came up with a nice one appropriately called pot music. Paradoxicality means that opposites seem to be true. Objectivity, that's the sense of this is true, this is really true that we talked about earlier. Transcendence of the ego, in which the ego seems to be put aside. For instance, if this jacket were my ego, I could take it off and put it to the side and realize there's still something underneath. Transience means it doesn't last always. Mood change, usually very positive. A sense of unity in which one feels at one with all the universe, or it may be a piece of music one feels one with. Sacredness and ineffability. Ineffability, I love that, ineffability. It means you can't find words to describe it. So people have experiences that they say are ineffable, and then they write a 500-page book about the ineffability of the experience. And change in behavior. So that's generally is that people change their behavior. The question about greed is one of the things Jim found in his dissertation, by the way. Jim did his dissertation on the effect of psychedelic experiences. It was the first one that was done. And one of the things he found was a decrease in what we would call, well, actually the 7 deadly sins, but particularly greed. So this is basically what a mystical experience is. We'll get to a book that describes these very nicely pretty soon. So let's look at experimental religious studies. And this is one of the areas that I think most needs development and is going to be hardest to develop. By the way, Johns Hopkins, the psilocybin team, is trying to recruit clergy to take part in an experiment to see how they would react to intense mystical experiences. I'm disappointed in that they only allow what I would call pulpit clergy rather than theologians or professors of religious studies. I think that's the group to reach because they are most open to trying new things. But anyway, let's talk about experimental religious studies. A slide ago, it mentioned 4 areas of religion: beliefs, rituals, aesthetics, or moral development, and organization. And I just want to go through and hit on some of the highlights of some of the ones that we've seen. Beliefs. Okay. The idea in that bottom box is there are mystical experiences are sort of the root of these more obvious parts of experience, part of religious experience, such as beliefs. That is, beliefs often make sense of their answer to the question, what was that? And let's take a look at some of those. This is the book that I mentioned before from Benny Shannon, the professor at Hebrew University. And he found that when he had experiences in Brazil, is that before the experience, I was an atheist, and after the experience, I believe in God. Now, that's his take on how to interpret the experience. Let me go back. This is a picture of Frances Vaughan, who was one of the early people to have legal psychedelic experiences. In a book called Psychedelic Reflections, she describes the experience that she had. Now, that handout that you have, it looks like a survey, okay? That is excerpted from this. And what I'd like you to do now, we're going to have a little survey, although you're going to keep the forms, I will not collect them. What I'd like you to do is to go through that survey, and as you go through each item, you'll be able to see how Frances described her basic mystical experience and the effect it had on religious studies. So just very quickly go through and fill out those forms, or circle the ones, or however you want, and we'll just take a hand vote. So do this very quickly, and go. Okay, let's just go through these items. The perennial philosophy and the esoteric teaching of all time suddenly made sense. How many bingos do we have? Right. Okay. I understood why spiritual seekers were instructed to look within. How many bingos do we have? All right. Think what this can do for classes in religious studies. Just astounding. Okay. The unconscious was revealed to be not only a useful concept, but an infinite reservoir of creative potential. Frances, by the way, started looking at the development of intuition largely as a result of this, and has written some books, one on intuition. I'm going to have to borrow somebody's because let's see. Can I borrow yours? Okay. I had been afforded a glimpse into the nature of reality. What a religious group we've got here. And the human potential within that reality. I mean, this is what the conference is, for Pete's sakes, right? Together with the direct experience of being myself, free of illusory identification and constrictions of consciousness. This should be our statement of faith. MAP's statement of faith. My understanding of mystical teaching, both Eastern and Western, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, and Sufi alike, took a quantum leap. I became aware of all great religions and understood for the first time the meaning of ecstatic states. Just think what we're losing by not including this in religious education. Just terrible. But we are making progress. There are at least 2 churches now that the Supreme Court has agreed to let to use ayahuasca. And there are all kinds of other churches that they haven't agreed to. So little by little we're making progress on this. And this brings up wonderful church-state freedom of religion issues. And a great area to argue about, probably forever. Okay, let's talk about rituals. I mean, the first is all beliefs, and I'll talk about some places rituals are beginning to show this. This is, again, a change of emphasis from religion as belief and wordy to direct experience. And this is a picture of the Marsh Chapel where the famous Good Friday experiment was conducted. It was conducted in that room you see down below, which is in the undercroft or the basement of the church. And 20 students from Andover Newton Theological Seminary were there. 5 were given mescaline, and 5 were given I think it was niacin to sort of make them feel they had some reaction. And this is a very famous experience. Rick Doblin, the picture of Rick up there in the corner, did a follow-up study of 25 years later of the people who were in the. It's a really excellent study, and he found that of the 10, no, he couldn't find everybody, but of the 10 people who had not had the psychedelic, a great many, in fact, most had left the ministry and changed. Those who had found their religious understanding deepened, and most remained in the ministry. Now, this is 25 years later. You couldn't find them all, and so you don't get a real statistical number out of this. But this is something that really deserves to be followed up on otherwise. So this was in 1963. The guy who wrote it was Walter Pankey, who already was an MD and a PhD, and was now getting a doctorate in religious studies at Harvard Divinity School. One of the books, or one of the flyers that I passed around, has a book called Sacred Knowledge by Richards. Richards is the best friend of Pankey, and he was in Pankey's wedding as an usher or bus man or something. And Richards now is one of the people who sits with the volunteers. Thanks you, Johns Hopkins, for calling your people volunteers, not subjects, during the psychedelic experiences. That's a very excellent book. So, in 1962 and 63, there was a Good Friday experiment, and now Johns Hopkins is doing some follow-up experiments. And there are a couple of excellent TED Talks by Roland Griffiths, who's headed the psychedelic team at Johns Hopkins. And I urge you to see those, or if you want to get a group interested in this area, I recommend the TED Talks. I've shown them to a men's group in my church with much interest on their part. So let's look at academic disciplines. At Johns Hopkins, they found that 33% of the people who were in one of their earlier experiments, which was not intended to have a religious orientation, said it was the single most spiritual experience in their life. An additional 38% said it was one of the top 5. Now, this is remarkable because the average age was 45, and people's approach to religion is generally set by the mid-20s. And here there was this group who about 2/3, that is, combining the 38 and the 33, had one of the 5 most significant mystical or religious experiences of their life. The work continues on this, and it's this type of movement from when they thought we were studying psychotherapy and turned out to be also studying religion, is that move from the psychotherapeutic basic of psychedelic thought to the next entheogenic use. Now look a bit at ethics and moral development. This is one of the most intriguing aspects that you find. When people drop or temporarily lose their ego, they lose the ego motivations. And in a literary sense, this is the 7 deadly sins, right? Anger, envy, sloth, gluttony, greed, and the guy in charge is always pride. Pride is self-centeredness. And when you're transcending yourself, you're going beyond self-centeredness and going into areas that are not motivated by the ego-centered values. So this gets at the question of greed being decreased in this. Jim also has a couple of people in his study and others who they were sort of very money-oriented, and after the mystical experience, sort of wanted work that was personally meaningful rather than just high-paying. In Stan Grof's work, and we find that he constantly mentions that people change their motivation when they have transcended their ego. Now, this does not happen all the time. You can have a blowout trip on Saturday afternoon and go back to being the same mean guy on Monday morning. But a lot of people don't. Or at least they have a different perspective on their own greed or own lust or laziness or wrath or whatever it is. So the taproot changes the mystical experience too. Here's Stan's book, and this is a quotation which gets at the social political angle. It's at the beginning of the chapter on the perinatal level. Even hardcore materialists, positively oriented scientists, skeptics and cynics, and uncompromising atheists and anti-religious crusaders, such as Marxist philosophers, become interested in the spiritual research when they reach this level of their mind. The reason Stan knows so much about Marxist philosophers is he did his early research in Prague and had Marxist philosophers as some of his clients. Now, this is a gem of a little book, and I really recommend it. Quantum Change. William Miller was a psychiatrist at University of New Mexico, and particularly was working with alcoholics. He had one of his clients come in and say, Dr. Miller, I had the most unusual experience, and started to describe this experience we would call a mystical experience or a sense of unity of consciousness. And being a psychiatrist, he was interested in this, wondered about it. His teenage daughter, who had been sort of a hard teenage daughter to be around, suddenly went through some kind of experience and changed like almost overnight. Being a psychiatrist, he thought, hey, what's going on here? Let's take a look at this. So he started to look in the psychiatric literature of this rapid positive change and basically found nothing. So this got him interested. He thought, I wonder who other people have had this happen to. So he put an ad in the Albuquerque newspaper to talk to people who had this type of experience and combined their results in this book called Quantum Change. And none of them were psychedelic mystical experiences. They all were, quote, natural, occurring just on their own. So what this book does is to say, this is the effect of mystical experiences as they're occurring naturally. But what we find is that the characteristics that he describes fit that pot music list of characteristics, and also match the characteristics that the Johns Hopkins people describe when they describe their mystical experiences. So we've got a parallel here between an almost identity between mystical experiences when they're happening naturally or happening artificially. This is an article that they wrote that describes the switch in values of people who had mystical experiences. These are the naturally occurring ones. On the left are listed men, and on the women right. And one of the areas that really ought to be looked at is why there are these differences and why these are particular switches and what do they have to do with gender. So before, the men listed their main wealth is their main adventure, wealth, adventure, achievement, pleasure, and to be respected as the main values. Now, they did not take the value inventory, then have the mystical experience, and then report it. But this was after the mystical experience, looking back saying, this is how I felt before, and this is how I feel now. So it's a sort of naturally occurring experience, but doesn't really is well controlled. And with women, they went from family to growth, independence to self-esteem, career to spirituality, fitting in to happiness, and attractiveness to generosity. So I think this gives us a new path of moral development, rather recognizing an existing path of moral development. That is transpersonal triggers, and there might be LSD, there might be any number of different things. These arrows are always, sometimes but not always arrows, because the stage does not always follow the first stage. So this then results in primary religious experiences. Also, I prefer to call them unitive consciousness, mystical experience, peak experience, oneness, and so forth. Always, or sometimes, but not always, this leads to what Maslow called the being values. Maslow, by the way, later in his life became very interested in Groff's work. And in the introduction to a little pamphlet he wrote on religion and peak experiences, he particularly recommends Groff's work. So these are things like truth, love, beauty, and so forth. And these then lead always, or rather not always, but sometimes, to a moral action. Life work, being dedicated to helping others. I think a lot of people in this room who are psychotherapists probably felt that transition in your lives. So what we have here is another path of moral development that may be looked at and may, of course, reflect the set and setting of the people having these experiences. And it shows up both in natural and psychedelic mystical experiences. Finally, in organizations, there are those two churches that I mentioned. Also, many people who became interested in meditation became interested through their psychedelic experiences. Tricycle is a Buddhist magazine, and they did a reader's response survey. Now, these are just people who wanted to respond, so it's not generalizable to the large population. 40% said their interest in Buddhism was sparked by psychedelics. 59% thought psychedelics and Buddhism do mix, and 40% do not mix. But 71% thought psychedelics are not a path, but they can provide a glimpse of the reality to which Buddhist practice points, sort of a trailer or a preview of coming attractions. Probably the best known philosopher of religion to write about psychedelics is Houston Smith, and this is his second book that had to do with his work with the Native American Church, published with Reuben Snake. There's, of course, ayahuasca, and there'll be a whole ring of ayahuasca sessions here. I recommend you're attending those if you're interested in religion and psychedelic experience. These are the two churches that have received approval by the U.S. Supreme Court. In the first one, União de Vegetal, they were importing ayahuasca, and they were intercepted, and it was turned over to the DEA, and they appealed that they wanted that it was a sacrament. It went to the local federal court. It went to the Denver District Court, and both courts chose in favor of the church. So the DEA appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court voted in favor of the church 8-0. And the reason it was 0 is that one of the justices had retired, Justice Roberts, and so he could not vote when the vote came up. So now 8-0 on the Supreme Court is one hell of a vote. And actually, they kicked it back to the district court, but that says you made a mistake, change it. And the Santo Daime is an Oregon church, which has had also a positive experience. So looking again at this overall map, what we're seeing now is a movement from over 1,500 years ago to a religion of ritual and activity, to the religion of religion and belief now, and then ending now, I think, entering the religion of primary religious experience. And so we see a transition now into an area that we're looking at and looking into. I'd like to adapt one of William Blake's poems on this. Children of a future age, reading this indignant page, know that in a former time a path to God was thought a crime. Blake was a path, a kind of love was thought a crime. So I think we're moving now into an area in which psychedelics will move not only into the mental health psychotherapy area, but then move up to the religion area, and I hope up into the higher humanities philosophical area, and then finally get into mind development. Oh, here's another. This spiritual growth with entheogens is a book that came out of a conference that Bob Jesse and the Council on Spiritual Practices and I organized in 1955. Originally, it had a different title, and the proceeds from this book go entirely to the Council on Spiritual Practices, and they are one of the funders of the Johns Hopkins research and the work being done by the Hefter Institute. So if you want to help them out and get a very interesting book, I recommend it. It's an anthology, a collection of, it's not a collection of papers at the conference. We asked the people who attended the conference to write them afterwards, taking in the information from the conference and basically summarizing their thoughts on it. So Houston Smith has a chapter in there, Charlie Tart, Stan Groff, Albert Hoffman. A lot of the main names attended that conference. And let me mention a couple other books. Sacred Knowledge, that's the handout, one of the handouts that's going around. Seeking the Sacred with Psychoactive Substances is a 2-volume anthology. It came out about 3 years ago. And Cleansing the Doors of Perception by Houston Smith is probably the best-known book for philosophers in the field. He wrote a book that collected his writings on cleansing the doors of perception. This came out of the conference that Bob Jesse and I organized in 1995. He was speaking at Northern Illinois University. I wanted to prepare my class to attend it. So I collected all the papers he come and had a Xerox copy made for the people in class to read and sent it on to Bob, and Bob turned it into a book. Cleansing also has a deluxe edition. If you're familiar with Wasson's books in deluxe editions, this is printed by the same printer in Italy who did the Wasson books, and is very much a collector's edition. I think Council on Spiritual Practices has a few editions of the deluxe edition available. And finally, this one, Eminent Elders Explore Continuing Impact of Entheogens, is exactly what it said it should be. And there's Entheogens and the Future Religion that Robert Forte put together. And finally, here's the quotation from Rick Dovlin on his follow-up of the Good Friday experiment. All psilocybin subjects participating in the long-term follow-up, but none of the controls, still consider their original experience to have had genuinely mystical elements and to have made a uniquely valuable contribution to their spiritual lives. Okay. I don't know if we do questions now or not, or do we go to lunch? Questions? You'll have to project. Yes. Oh wait, here comes the mic.
Well, I'm sympathetic to your claims about moral development or a pathway to moral development through psychedelic use. I'm just wondering how you can reconcile that with claims of very unscrupulous behaviors by ayahuasca shamanic practitioners, including sexual assaults and ripping people off and dosing them with things like Toei, etc. Just, it's sort of a discrepancy that I'm wondering if you've thought about or have any comments on. Thanks.
No, I don't reconcile it at all. And clearly that it's going to happen. It probably, I don't know what to attribute it to, other than the set and settings being so very different in each of those cases. But other than, I'm not very satisfied with my answer, but that's the best I can come up with.